I do believe in fairies. I do. I might not have seen any of them, but that doesn't mean they're not there.
Their world opens up and closes, and we're lucky to see it when it opens, and we were lucky to see it that day.
If you live in Cape Breton long enough, you see things happen, like with the synchronicity of events and how things unfold. If you don't believe in spirits, you have a hard time explaining something.
Hello, I'm Tom Murphy. Welcome to Land and Sea. Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia, is a land where the mists and the myths of time converge. It's a magical island, rich with folklore, especially when it comes to fairies, or as some people call them, the little people. The stories about them have helped shape the island's culture, and there are many who believe the fairies are still among us today. While many agree that fairies do exist, it's not clear what they actually look like. Every artist has a different take. Most fairies have human qualities, some with appendages like wings, some are masculine, some are feminine, or something in between. Most stories describe their exceptional musical and dancing abilities. Some fairies seem to be kind, but some malicious or evil. And fairies can come in many forms, as pixies, as brownies, goblins, elves, and as the wee folk. The list is endless. It's also not clear where they live, but most believe they are in tune with nature in all its splendor, which is why Cape Breton may be the perfect place for their existence. The Mi'kmaq first settled this land, and like most North American indigenous nations, the Mi'kmaq have a compelling and engaging connection to the little people. Clifford Paul is a Mi'kmaq guide.
The Mi'kmaq people are spiritual people, so we're kind of like inclined to be seeing things that would make other people just shake their heads or not, or stand in disbelief. But if you're a spiritual person, there's a strong connection to the earth, there's a strong connection to the earth mother, there's a strong connection to the spirits of the land, the water, the rocks, the trees.
Here along the rugged Cape Breton coastline, there is one special spot that is essential to the Mi'kmaq culture. While many Cape Bretoners call this place the home of the fairy hole, the Mi'kmaq have a different name. They call it Glooskap Cave. Glooskap is a god and hero in legends of the Mi'kmaq, created out of a bolt of lightning.
This is what we're told by elders of other tribes, that the center of the universe is located on an island in North America, the east coast of North America, and it is protected by the strongest tribe of all the nations. So the elder that told us that story was describing Glooskap Cave. And when Glooskap would leave us, wouldn't it be logical for him to go to the center of the universe, to go into the other realm and start his journey from there?
The Mi'kmaq believe this sacred place is protected. People who hike to the cave often comment that they've been assisted or made to feel comfortable by the little people.
I've brought hundreds of youth. I brought elders here on hikes. No two hikes are the same. And we have people who say, I seen something, or I feel like I'm being watched. I feel safe. And they asked me, have you seen the little people here? I said, no, but I know they're there. And I may not have seen them, but I know they have seen me.
About an hour away is the community of Eskasoni. Hugging the beautiful Burdor Lake, it has the highest population of any Mi'kmaq band in the Maritimes, and where many speak the Mi'kmaq language. Just outside Eskasoni, Mary Rose Julian and her daughter April Julian are looking for something quite remarkable they discovered 15 years ago.
As we were walking, I looked over to the trees here, and I noticed a small cave. It was about this high. And I walked right up to it. And I guess I got on my knees. I was curious. Mom, look. What is it? I don't know. I got on my knees. I was about to stick my head in there. And my mom told me, and I quote, "What the hell are you doing?" And she told me to get my head out of there. We both knew what it was. It was the entrance to the little people's world. And she asked me not to put my head in there, and she suggested that we leave immediately.
Which they did. Mary Rose had heard the stories about the little people. In fact, the former school teacher had written a book for children about them. It was a way to teach her students the Mi'kmaq language. But here's the twist. 25 years before finding the fairy cave, Mary Rose had all 5 of her children here on a hot summer day for a swim and a picnic. That's when Mary Rose heard something out of this world.
It sounded like flutes or music of some kind, and it was also singing mixed up with the music. It was very alien to me, and I didn't want my children around here anymore. So I grabbed, I threw them all in the car, and the girls jumped in the car. I told everybody, don't look back. I didn't know what they were going to see. If, maybe it was some monster or something coming out of the woods. My car was old, and it was a jump start. Like, you had to use a screwdriver to start the car, and it was standard. And I wasn't too very keen on driving that. I just learned how to drive it, and I was hoping and praying that it'll start right away and that I'll be able to take off smoothly out of there. And it started right away. I was relieved, and I slowly let the clutch go, and I got out of there. I took off. I told him not to look back. But my youngest daughter never listens.
I got up and I looked back, and just behind you there, I saw a couple dancing, and then one came out of the bushes on the other side. They just started coming out of everywhere, about 6 or 7 of them. And they were all dancing in a circle. And then one stood there on the outside of the dance circle and looked at me. It was like a little old man. And it came, as my mom was pulling away, it came chasing after the car. And it came after the car really fast. It was obvious, it's no problem. They were going to catch up with it. And it just stopped and looked at me as we drove away. Their clothes are like nature. That's probably why people say they can't see them when they're out there. They're a little taller than the rear bumper of the car we were driving away in, and that would be about the same height as the cave we found.
April Julian didn't tell anybody for years about her remarkable encounter until her brother badgered it out of her.
I was told if you say anything about them, that you're inviting bad luck, bad things to happen to you, and those you love.
Although she has searched many times, she hasn't been able to find the fairy cave since.
Their world opens up and closes, and we're lucky to see it when it opens, and we were lucky to see it that day.
When the Scots immigrated to Cape Breton, they brought their fairy culture with them. Into the Mystic when we come back. More than 240 years ago, a wave of Scottish exiles arrived in Cape Breton. They felt at home here, the Cape Breton landscape being so similar to Scotland. Most of them spoke Gaelic, the language they used in the mother country. These Scots were practical and used to hard work, but they harbored another side. When they arrived from Scotland, they brought with them their faith in fairies, a belief that can be traced back centuries. Colette Thomas was raised on the island by her grandparents. She heard Gaelic spoken every day, and growing up, her grandfather enchanted her with many stories about the fairy realm. She heard more stories here at Highland Village, where she worked when she was younger.
Oh, some of them are definitely bad, and I hope no ill will comes to me for saying that, because you never speak ill of a fairy. But yeah, they're definitely not all good.
Today, Colette Thomas is a filmmaker and writer whose fascination with fairies continued into adulthood, and she loves to share their stories.
There was a party, and it was before there was indoor plumbing or any of this. And it was in the winter time, and there's a lot of party, and there was a big party going on. And there was this man, and he went outside to use the washroom because that's what you had to do. And so out he went, and he wasn't coming back. And everybody was in the house wondering, you know, what happened to him? And he wasn't coming back, and he wasn't coming back, and finally he showed up in the door, and he was all like kind of beside himself, and he was all rumpled up and stuff and shaken up. And they asked him what happened, and he said he went outside and the fairies took him. And they took him down the hill and all across the ice, and it wasn't until he said something like, "God help me," and they dropped him then. And that's when he was able to make his way back. But they just took him off just for something to do, to have fun, and who knows where they would have taken him eventually. Maybe into the glen or whatever, to the fairy hill. So who knows, but they just will do things like that.
Thomas believes the fairies have the incredible ability to adapt to the world around them.
So there's a picture here that you can see, and that's one that's, you think nothing of it, but it's a fairy basically hiding in broad daylight from you. It took a form in the cliff as a deer. They can disappear within your own environment around you. So that would be it in broad daylight, him there, but nobody would think anything of it because they think, oh, it's just a cliff, and oh yeah, it looks kind of like a deer. But to others that may know that, they know that that was actually a fairy hiding in broad daylight.
The county and the town of Inverness were formerly called the Sheen. Sheen means the house or land of the fairies. Traces of that identity still exist. Longtime historian and storyteller Jim St. Clair is walking a fairy mound in Inverness County. Although he's never seen a fairy, he's always looking for one. He was told by members of his own family that fairies used to live in this mound, and he's been told many other tales too.
If you had milked and brought the milk into the pantry in order for the cream to rise so that you could make butter the next day, you might go in the next day and the milk and the butter, which were quite fresh from the cow the day before, had turned sour. So it was always said that the fairies did that, just out of mischievousness.
This is the Stewartdale Cemetery, also in Inverness County. There was once a church here, but in the 1850s, this site was the location of the largest outdoor communion service in Nova Scotia. Coincidentally, there was a fairy mound just a few kilometers away. People came from all over, by boat, on horseback, and by wagon. The Presbyterians were expecting about 2,000 to 3,000 people over the 7 days, but between 5,000 and 7,000 showed up. They were panicking because they were running out of food. But then the magic happened.
For the remainder of the week, every morning when the people assembled here, on the steps of the church, there were large wicker baskets filled with very sweet bread. Nobody knew where they came from, and they were not the kind of food that the people here were accustomed to making, but it was sustenance. And I had heard it from people in my own family that the food had actually been brought here by the little people.
But Colette Thomas believes fairies can have a malicious side too. People, at least in days gone by, used to defend themselves from the little people.
Iron is a protection against the fairies, so when people would go out in the fields, they would always tend to have, like, even if it was just a nail in their pocket or something, to protect themselves so the fairies couldn't take them away. They couldn't steal them off to the fairy realm or whatever, if they had the iron. You never want to build your house on a fairy hill or a fairy road. So when they would be trying to figure out where they were going to put their house, they would kind of cut 4 corners of where the corners of the house would be, and then turn the sods over, and they would leave it overnight. And then when they would come back in the morning, if any of the sods were turned back over, it meant that that was a fairy hill. They had turned it over so they could keep walking. So they knew that they couldn't build the house there, so they would have to move it a bit so they wouldn't block the fairy road, because they didn't. That would just be causing havoc to them, because the fairies would probably retaliate against them for building on their road.
When we come back, exploring the curious connection between horses and fairies. Most of us live busy, noisy, chaotic lives fueled by technology. Very few of us can quiet ourselves enough to look for or hear another world, but some do, and there may be no more perfect place to do that than in Cape Breton. There are ocean, field, and mountain views everywhere you look. This stunning landscape forms the backdrop for the belief in fairies for many cultures that live on the island. Inverness County is steeped in a strong folklore tradition, and more stories about the fairies seem to come out of here than any other place on the island. Jeff Lee has lived in the backwoods here for more than 40 years. Born in the United States, Jeff visited here and just fell in love with the Cape Breton landscape. He knew there was something different about the island, and it's still a magical place to him.
If you live in Cape Breton long enough, you see things happen, and you see it like with the synchronicity of events and how things unfold. If you don't believe in spirits, you have a hard time explaining some things.
For years, Lee was a busy farmer, and that's where he had his first encounter with the fairies.
I'd gone out to the barn to feed the horses, and in our barn there's a chute where you throw the hay from the hay mow down into the alleyway in front of the horses, and then I would go down and take the hay from the alleyway and put it in their mangers. So that's what I did. I went up into the hay mow and, forked the hay down into the chute, and then down into the aisle. And we had cows at the time, so I was working on them, and then I came around to put the hay in the horses' mangers, and the hay was already in their mangers. I don't know who put them in or who put it in, but it wasn't me.
Jeff Lee then made more connections with the fairies on his land.
Well, it was Easter Sunday morning, and we had a team of horses, and I went out to feed them. Horses, you clip them into their stable on the halter with a clip. So I came in, unclipped the horse, and I had a nail on the post coming down that I would hang the clip. And when I went to hang the clip on the nail, this was hanging on the nail. And I looked at it and wondered, how did that get there? Because I didn't think that the horse did that by rubbing its mane against the nail. But I just left it there, and I fed the horses and, did my chores. And then when the horses came in, one of them had another braid on it, this, and then the other one had these two braids on it. And that really got me thinking. And so what we did, I said, well, I'm going to cut these off so that people will believe me when I say I found some braids in the horse's manes. I can't braid, but somebody that knew how to braid would have a hard time doing something like this. And if you notice, this little knot at the top is very similar to the knots that they would put in horses' tails when people would be going to church, or you'll see them in parades now with the draft horses. They'll braid the tails and knot them up so that they don't have a long tail hanging down and getting mud on it and getting wet and that.
Jeff showed them around, but it wasn't until he met up with Father John Angus Rankin that he received a satisfactory answer. Father John Angus was a highly respected priest in Cape Breton. He was one of the architects of the fiddle revival here in the 1970s. Turns out he also believed in the little people.
I told him my story about the braids, and then he told me his story about the fairy braids. And he came home one night and he had horses at the time, and he noticed the horses galloping around the pasture, which they never did. They were just work horses. They weren't excitable or anything like that. And the next day, when he came out and put them in the barn, he noticed they had braids in their manes too. So at the end of the conversation, I asked Father Janangus, well, what do you think it is? And he smiled at me and he said, kindred spirits. So that was good enough for me.
Jeff Lee has found his way to understanding and accepting that the fairies are part of the landscape here.
We're all kindred spirits. With the fairies, they're not harming anybody. They're just doing what they have to do. You know, we're all here basically to help each other out.
It doesn't matter whether you believe fairies are a force for good or evil. It doesn't matter whether you even believe in fairies. What does matter is that all these stories have come together to shape contemporary Cape Breton Island, and that today we still get a chance to connect with the other world.